All right. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Coach Chris from Four Star Endurance here in Chicago. And with me today is Coach Ricky Romersi, one of our newest coaches. Ricky has joined our coaching staff this year as one of our exciting new coaches. And we'll be talking today and having really him talk. I'm actually excited to hear him talk and present this topic. So I'll be doing a lot of listening. But just to do the formal introduction, I'm going to kick us off here. The main topic today is demystifying a lot about just physiology and training and science, but the idea of zone 2 training, understanding VO2 max a little bit, understanding lactate testing, how that applies to endurance sports. Specifically, we'll be talking a lot about triathlon, but it also relates to running and cycling and other endurance sports. And Coach Ricky right now is an assistant tri-coach at Liberty University, so out on the East Coast, and has been using several different training tools with us. My coaching business that we founded several years ago is called Four Star Endurance, but you'll also hear us make references to Metabolic Athlete, which is our performance lab here in Chicago. Ricky actually came in and did a VO2 test earlier this year. And our Four Star Club is our athlete club. So athletes that want private coaching support. We have a community of athletes where you get a bunch of coaching, kind of like coaching light support, in addition to options for private coaching. But we'll answer that stuff about questions about that later on. So today we're going to talk about demystifying training, but a little bit about Coach Ricky. So he has a strong swimming background. So both competing at both the YMCA and junior swimming nationals, but more specifically and recently this year in particular, I think this is your second time competing at the collegiate club nationals. And so this was in April. Had a race, and you can see his swim time is pretty good, under 20-minute swim, over 20-mile-an-hour bike. His running might have needed a little bit of work at that point in the season, but pretty darn good performance. Anytime you can do around 2:30 for an Olympic, that's definitely a strong athlete for sure. And then after that, which was in April in Chicago, he came in. We did a VO2 test using our core cardio coach system to dial in his training zones, look at his metabolic efficiencies, kind of see where he is and where he can improve. And then he used the TriDot system, the TriDot triathlon training tool, to really guide his training, which focuses quite a bit on working the right combination of energy systems, using AI and machine learning to optimize training. Essentially train smarter, not harder, and see better improvements in less time. And he did fantastically well. So we brought him on board as a coach right as he headed into USAT Nationals, where he actually did two races. He did both the Olympic and the sprint on back-to-back days. Actually, I think the Olympic was first, and went under 2:10. So he did a 2:09:50, 20-minute swim, over 24 miles an hour on the bike, 7-minute mile run. And then the next day, you did even better. You did under 120 per 100-meter swim, so under 10 minutes on your sprint swim. It was a windy day, so the bike was a little bit slower. I think 23 miles an hour, still very impressive on that course that has a very, very big hill on it. And then ran sub 7-minute miles. And that was on your second day after the Olympics. So finished top 20 in the country in your age group. That's pretty darn impressive to be in top 20 at nationals, essentially in that Team USA qualifying range, right around there. So very, very nice performance. And he's been coaching with us through Four Star Endurance and using the TriDot tool as well as several other tools. And coming up, you still have one more race. So you've got Ironman Florida coming up here really quick. We're excited to see how Ricky will do there. And yeah, so that's kind of him from an athletic background. And so I'm going to turn it over to him to really dig into our topic today. And yeah, take it from there. So tell us a little bit more, Ricky, about your background, and then we can kind of jump right in.
Yeah, hey guys, thanks for coming. I wanted to give a quick shout out to Dan Caskey and Team Inspire. I know a lot of people from there are coming to support this event, so thank you for coming. Yeah, so as Chris said, I am currently the assistant triathlon coach at Liberty University in Lynchburg, Virginia. They're a top 10 finishing team every year at club nationals. Very strong team, very strong athletes, and I'm very lucky to be working with them, and I'm having a great time out there. So I got into coaching after graduating this past spring from the University of Miami. I got my master's in applied physiology. So that's focusing on things like strength and conditioning, exercise physiology, a little bit of nutrition, things like that. But my heart lies in endurance sport and triathlon. I'm also an ACSM certified exercise physiologist. I'm a certified USAT coach and USA cycling coach. So I have a little QR code there with my card and everything. So if you guys want to, that'll come up a couple times in the presentation. So no rush to get to it now. But you can also follow me on Instagram, and that's basically how I got to where I am now, and working with Chris and training with Chris, which has been a real treat. So let's get into it. First, want to kind of have you guys maybe in the chat talk about some of your goals and questions. So here are just some things to maybe prompt some questions for those of you who have some background in some of this training terminology. So yeah, drop it in the chat. Maybe Chris can read a couple off for us since I actually can't see the chat right now. But yeah, if anything pops up, if not, we can keep moving. But these are the sorts of things that we will be covering.
Yeah, I think these are some of the questions that we got ahead of time. So we'll kind of delve. I think you'll talk about each one of these. But yeah, no questions yet. We'll answer questions at the very end. So if folks have things that pop in your head, put it in the chat as we go along.
Absolutely. All right, we'll keep moving along then. So, before I get into the overview of the talk, I kind of want to give my rationale for giving the talk. So I think it'll be very helpful for coaches who maybe don't have a huge theoretical background in exercise physiology. Paths to coaching are very, very different. I was fortunate in that mine was very academic and very, theoretically rigorous. And now I'm getting to apply that theory and now share that theory with other coaches. And I also wanted to do it a bit to, and I talked about this before on social media, but to empower athletes who, have a coach or are self-trained and just want to have a little bit more knowledge to maybe engage with more productive dialogue about their training with their coaches, or even just, be able to design better programs for themselves and potentially even hop onto a platform like TriDot that is AI powered, does a lot of the thinking for them, but they're still able to understand the why of the process, so they can trust the process and really know what's happening and feel good about their training. So to that end, we're going to talk about how our bodies produce energy. So the three main energy systems, the different fuel sources that they use to make energy. We're going to talk about training zones, so how you determine training zones, and then also why you train in different zones, so the adaptations that those zones give to you. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what I mean by distribution of training zones is essentially how much time you should be spending in each zone as you're training. And that really ties into periodization. So again, how your different intensities and volumes change over the course of a season as you get ready for an event. Then I'm going to briefly share some coaching resources that Chris and I have for you guys. And at that point, we'll take some questions. So we're going to hop right into it. So this molecule here is really the crux of everything that humans do, not just in sport. And that is ATP, adenosine triphosphate. So you can see on the left, it has 3 phosphate groups. When this hydrolyzes, one of those phosphates comes off, and that releases energy. And that allows our bodies not just to do mechanical work like moving and flexing our muscles, but basically everything, right? It's free energy for maintaining warmth in our body, all those sorts of things. And so basically our energy systems use different means to produce ATP. And there are 3 energy systems. There's the phosphocreatine system, PCR system, There's the glycolytic system, right? So that's generally anaerobic, right? No oxygen. And then we have the aerobic energy system, which uses oxygen. And those latter two are typically where endurance athletes tend to live, but it's still important to understand all three. So I'll still include the PCR. So something that I really want to drive home today as well, when people first learn about these systems and think about them, they have this sort of idea that the systems function very discreetly, one or the other, when that is absolutely not the case almost ever, right? I would venture to say never, right? So a good way to think about it is these energy systems. I don't know if anyone in the crowd is a DJ, but these energy systems are a mixer board, right? They're not on-off switches. So depending on the time and intensity of what you're doing, you will have different relative contributions by each one of these systems as you're doing it, right? So it's not like, oh, I'm purely using aerobic energy system pathways or purely glycolytic or purely PCR. They're all always contributing to different elements of uh, giving us usable energy for mechanical work and homeostasis, right? So let's jump into the first system, the phosphocreatine system. So phosphocreatine is actually a substance that is stored in your muscles, right? So we have a phosphate group and it's attached to creatine. So if anyone knows about the supplement creatine, that's exactly what this is. And so what happens is when you use ATP, it's hydrolyzed and it becomes ADP, adenosine diphosphate, right? So it can not really produce much more energy for us. So what phosphocreatine does is it uses an enzyme called creatine kinase, which takes the phosphate from phosphocreatine and reattaches it to ADP to remake ATP. And this system is really a max intensity system, right? So it's in movement initiation, or like if you're really like a maximal sprint effort or a maximal force production effort, like if you're pushing a really heavy weight as hard as you can. And in very well-trained people, if you are at that intensity, you're looking at maybe 10 to 30 seconds of this system being able to produce an energy for you maximally. And 30 seconds is generous. Really, it's probably closer to 15. And if you're getting to 20 plus, like you're a special person, right? The downside, it is very slow to recover, right? So if you completely drain your phosphocreatine stores in exertion, you're looking at like 9 to 10 minutes for total replenishment. So very slow to recover. So here's a diagram of that phosphocreatine and creatine interconverting with ATP and ADP. Don't need to worry about that too much. That's for anyone who's a big nerd like me's gratification. But again, so if you're training the system and you really want to maximize, phosphocreatine function, and you're depleting it in your efforts, you should be recovering for a very long time. Otherwise, you're not working in that correct energy system, and you're not training effectively. So there are some differences that we see in different sport athletes that live in the system. So if we take a sprinter like Usain Bolt, generally speaking, he's going to have better enzyme activity as opposed to an Olympic weightlifter like Lasha Talakazi. They both live in this PCR world, right, where they're doing maximal intensity for very brief moments. But the difference between them, right, is Lasha Talakazi is going to have huge phosphocreatine stores, right? So he has a lot of the substrate, a lot of the actual phosphocreatine that is ready to give him like a ton of energy all at once. Whereas someone like Usain Bolt, slightly more prolonged, the forces aren't quite as high, still incredibly high, but it's not as instantaneous, right? So what happens in an athlete like that is they actually get better enzyme activity. So that phosphocreatine kinase generally tends to function a little bit faster. So some cool facts. Then we have the glycolytic energy system. So this is breaking down carbohydrates. It's the first step in breaking down carbohydrates. That's either glycogen or glucose. And they're broken down into pyruvate. So Pyruvate is then reduced to lactate, and then that is going to be put into the Krebs cycle later, which is the aerobic process. But glycolysis itself is an anaerobic process, so it does not require oxygen. And if you are in the peak glycolytic intensity, which again is going to be lower than the phosphocreatine intensity, you're looking at this lasting you on a scale of minutes, right? 2 to 5 minutes, probably, like not incredibly long still, in terms of, endurance sport anyway. And this is also pretty slow to recover, but it's not going to be as bad as the phosphocreatine system. So again, you're looking at a scale of minutes, but not like 9 or 10 minutes like the phosphocreatine system. So as you can see, you get a net gain of 2 ATP here. So it's not the most efficient pathway, but it's still pretty good, right? And one thing I want to note, we're going to talk about lactate a lot, but lactate does not cause fatigue. It does not cause acidosis, right? It is correlated, but not causative to acidosis when you are exerting yourself. It also does not cause DOMS, right? So these are slightly outdated ideas about lactate. It's a very active metabolite. It's a signaling molecule. We'll get into that. And it is also a mobile fuel source. So very important in endurance sports and in metabolism in general. And it's not as bad as it's been given a rep to have, right? Cool. And then the final energy system we have is the aerobic energy system. So this system takes pyruvate. So after you go through glycolysis, you have your pyruvate or even your lactate, or even fats or proteins, and puts them through by various means into the Krebs cycle, or the tricarboxylic acid cycle, citric acid cycle. These are all the same names for the same process. And then through the electron transport chain and oxidative phosphorylation. That's a lot. All you really need to know is that essentially what's happening is you're using oxygen now, right? So you're oxidizing different metabolites to produce ATP. So this is an incredibly efficient process that we have. It lasts very, very long, essentially indefinitely. You can do this until you die. In fact, you do it until you die. But it is at much lower intensity. So it's not as fast at producing ATP. So therefore you have less usable energy at any given moment from this system. Again, it's the most efficient, and it actually aids in the recovery of other systems. So the phosphocreatine recovery that takes 9-10 minutes, and the glycolytic recovery that takes, again, several minutes, is mediated by the aerobic system, right? So that's an active recovery process. So how do we get that energy? Well, we have 3 main fuel sources: proteins, fats, and carbs, right? And this comes from things that we eat. It's carbon energy. So we're going to talk about each one of them a little bit. So we'll start with protein. I'll start by asking, when is protein a fuel source? Do you have kind of an idea in mind of when that happens? Well, protein is generally not something that we want as a fuel source or something that we're burning. So it's a fuel source generally when we're not in the best state. So if you think of Tom Hanks in Castaway, when he's like starving a little bit, that's when he's using protein, right? And the reason that we don't often think of protein as a fuel source, really, or we don't want it to be a primary fuel source, is that protein's function in our body is generally more structural. So we have enzymes that carry out processes. Those are proteins. A lot of the structural elements to like our muscles and different tissues are protein elements, or our skin and our hair and stuff. So we don't really want to be consuming that, right? Because that literally breaks away at the integrity of our body. So it's not an ideal fuel source. That being said, it's burned aerobically, for your information. Then we have fats. So fats are a very important fuel source for endurance athletes. One source of fat is we have inter and intramuscular fat. So that is inside of our muscles, in between muscle fibers and inside of muscle fibers. We have little fat droplets. We also have visceral fat. So this is fat that is in and around our internal organs. And it's very deep within our abdominal cavity, below our muscles, wrapping around our organs. This is actually the fat that is generally associated with poorer health, metabolic syndrome, diabetes, those types of things. Cardiovascular disease is highly correlated with visceral fat. And then we have subcutaneous fat. And this is the fat that is underneath your skin that is generally visible. So like if you think of someone who is larger or obese and you can see the fat that you might pinch when you're doing the body composition measurements, that is subcutaneous fat. So I have some small diagrams for that for us. So you can see a muscle, you have these groups of muscle fibers, these fascicles, and within those muscle fibers, you see little fat droplets. That's intramuscular fat. Then we have subcutaneous fat. So again, that's like the more visible fat that we kind of think of when we think of someone who is obese or overweight. And then we have visceral fat, which is beneath the abdominal wall and is associated with poorer health outcomes. Fat is also burned aerobically. I have a fun sort of guess for you guys. So how does intramuscular fat compare in trained athletes, untrained people, and type 2 diabetics? So I just want you to think for a second about how you think those intramuscular, so again, this is fat in your muscles, how those levels might compare among these types of people. So you guys probably have something in mind. So a trained athlete is actually going to have, especially a trained endurance athlete, is going to have very high intramuscular fat levels, right? It's a very important fuel source that we use. It sustains us for a very, very long time, and it lasts pretty indefinitely. So they have pretty high IM fat levels compared to untrained people, right? Untrained people are going to have much lower intramuscular fat. If you think about someone who's type 2 diabetic or someone with metabolic syndrome, they're actually also going to have very elevated intramuscular fat levels, right? It's going to be very high. The difference is the trained athletes are able to mobilize and use that fat as a fuel, whereas someone who has metabolic syndrome does that very poorly or doesn't because of a sedentary lifestyle. So if you think about it, the fat in the muscles of an athlete are sort of wringed out and replenished, whereas someone who is maybe sedentary, has other health problems, it accumulates, but it is never used, right? And very frequently in those people, you see something called lactatemia because they use fat very poorly. They have more glycolysis happening in their body, and so they have higher resting lactate levels, which causes other signaling problems, which perpetuate the issue, but we can get into that a little bit later. All right. And then the final fuel source that everyone loves, carbohydrates. So generally in our body, on average, a lot of these numbers are averages. We have around 500 grams of carbohydrates. Some of that is in your blood, right? So you think about blood sugar, blood glucose. We have about 10 grams of that at any given moment. It'll vary depending on, if you're exercising and not eating, if you just ate. But generally, it's very tightly regulated and tends to hover around 10 grams of blood glucose. We have 90 grams of hepatic glycogen. So that is carbohydrate stores in our liver. That is basically what is used to regulate blood glucose and get glucose to working tissues. It's a store that we have that, again, helps us regulate blood sugar. And then finally, we have 400 grams roughly of muscular glycogen. So these are carbohydrates that are stored in our muscles and are used by those muscles to do work and produce energy. So what is bonking? Carbohydrates inform us about bonking. So bonking is if you go out and you go on a very long bike ride or a very long run or maybe a very long open water swim if that's your jam, and you don't eat, you don't replenish glycogen stores or carbohydrates, eventually you'll kind of just feel like crap. You'll get very, very tired. Continuing to exert yourself, even at a very moderate pace, will feel very unpleasant. You might even get like disoriented. It's not a good feeling. I've been there. I'm sure we've all been there. It's almost like a rite of passage to do it at least once in endurance training, but if you can avoid it, that is best. So why does it occur around 90 minutes? Again, this is an average, and training will impact kind of how long you can last without bonking as well. But the reason we sort of think of 90 minutes as sort of the period where you would start to bonk is because what happens when we bonk is we lose the ability to regulate blood glucose. And that happens when we deplete hepatic glycogen. And on average, when we're doing endurance exercise, we tend to use carbs at a rate of 1 gram per minute. So you have 90 grams of hepatic glycogen, roughly. So after about roughly 90 minutes, that's depleted. Your blood glucose gets dysregulated, and our brain, which feeds primarily off carbohydrates, starts to sense that and says, whoa, you got to slow down right now, or we're going to start starving and things are going to get really bad. So you start to feel like crap, and proceeding to exercise seems like a really bad idea because it feels really bad. So what does this mean for fueling for longer and shorter events? Well, if you're doing very long events, over 90 minutes, over 2 hours, 4 or 5 hour events, 15-hour events, if you're doing Ironman or something, it means you need to eat regularly. People say roughly 90 grams of carbohydrates a minute. Those guidelines seem to be going up and up and up. People are saying even excess of 120 grams of carbohydrates, an hour. And that's very difficult to do, but it's something that we can train ourselves to do. So as we get into larger and larger training volumes, we should be eating more and more. Our GI system learns to tolerate that, and it also learns to absorb fuel more efficiently. So fuel absorption is a trainable element of our physiology that we can develop as we increase training volumes. Now, even in a shorter event, let's say like an hour, like if you do a sprint triathlon, it's around an hour, hour 15. It's important to eat. And it's been shown that even just putting carbohydrates in your mouth, swishing them around, not swallowing, spitting them out, will delay time to fatigue and improve performance. And the reason for that is that we have carbohydrate receptors, not sweet taste receptors, carbohydrate receptors in our mouth that tell us fuel is incoming, we can exert ourselves. So even in a short event, it's important to eat, right? Carbohydrates are burned both aerobically and anaerobically. And I also want to talk about muscular glycogen. So we have this common idea that muscular glycogen is locked in our muscles and it can't be transported around our other tissues, right? So the way that glycolysis works with glycogen is it breaks off a piece of glycogen and immediately phosphorylates it so it can't leave the cell and it's processed in that cell. And so we think of it as locked in that cell. But is it really? Because what happens after is it's processed glycolytically and it turns into lactate. Lactate can leave a cell. Lactate is a usable carbon fuel source. So lactate is actually a means by which carbon energy in the form of carbohydrates can move from muscle cells to other muscle cells or other active tissues. And we actually see this in people like cyclists who only use specific tissues like their legs. Inactive tissues in their arms will produce lactate and shuttle it selectively to their legs and thereby, give their legs more carbon energy in order to continue going. After exercise, lactate is a very important gluconeogenic precursor. So lactate is reconverted into glucose and glycogen. So that's also a means by which we recycle that carbon energy. So that can be up to 30% of glucose is recycled lactate. So it's a very, very important metabolite. It's not just a bad guy, it's an incredibly good guy, right? And I want that to hit home with you guys today a little bit. So now that we've talked about energy systems and we've talked about fuel sources, we can get into training zones and zone determination. So we'll start with zone determination. There's really two ways by which you can determine zones. You can do field tests. So for the cyclists out there, that's, classically you think of a 20-minute FTP test. You can do the 2x8 minute test. There's a couple of a variety of field tests you can do. You can even do an hour time trial, 15-kilometer time trial. Runners, you can do a 5K running assessment, 10K. You can use PRs from events. And swimmers, we use 500, 1,000 yard time trials, or we even can use the 400, 200 critical swim speed test. So these are validated field tests. What a field test is designed to do, and they're validated and they're very good at doing this, is based on the averages of the population, estimating where these different metabolic states you have while you're exercising exist, right? Where at what intensities they occur. And they're, like I said, they're very good at doing this. But I want to emphasize that they're generally based on human averages, right? And very many of us, in fact, all of us, are not exactly average, right? So while these tests can and are very good, especially for beginner athletes, as you sort of dial in your training zones, you really want to get into lab testing. So that's something that Coach Chris does at 4 Star Endurance. That's something that I really want to be involved with and do. And these are things like VO2 and gas exchange testing. So that picture of me with the mask, that was a VO2 test. And that looks at fuel usage and your VO2 max, which we'll talk about. And then there's lactate testing, which is, you take a little needle, prick your finger or your ear, get a drop of blood, and you can measure how much lactate is at your blood at different intensities. And in that way, more precisely determine your individual training zones and figure out where those metabolic states are in terms of training intensity. So we're going to talk about both of these things and talk about, different ways of doing them. So one way that you could do that is by looking at heart rate. So we'll say our x-axis here is work intensity. Our y-axis is our heart rate. As our work intensity increases, our heart rate will elevate as the demands of exercise increase. You can use a bunch of field tests to figure out what your max heart rate is. Generally, you can also do a Carbonin method estimate. So 220 minus your age is the classic one. That's a very, very like back of the envelope estimate. It's generally not very precise or ideal to use, but it's a good, quick and dirty way to figure this out. At around 90% of your maximum heart rate, 85 to 95%, if you want to get a range, will be your zone 4, your threshold. And at around 70%, but even as low as 60 to 65%. I think when Chris and I tested mine, it was 60%, which is again why testing is important, because these averages aren't always correct. 65 to 75 or even 70 to 80% is what's going to be your zone 2. So if your zone 2, zone 4, in between that is your zone 3, below is zone 1, above zone 5 and 6. And we'll get into the zones in a moment. One thing that's important to note about heart rate is that there's this thing called cardiac drift. So if you sit at the same work intensity for a prolonged period of time, your heart rate will climb, even if your intensity does not climb. And there's a variety of reasons for this. If it's hot and humid and you're not cooling efficiently, your heart rate will rise. If you're sweating a lot, your blood plasma will decrease because you're losing a lot of fluid, and therefore your heart has to beat more to continue to perfuse your tissues. So your heart rate will steadily climb. Another metric that we can look at for zone determination is your VO2. So if you have an estimate of your VO2 while you're working out, you can do this. As you work and work and work, we can see along the x-axis, eventually we hit our VO2 max. 85% of our VO2 max is generally what's considered threshold. 65% of VO2 max is usually where we see our zone 2. So as you can see on this graph, you can continue to work above your VO2 max. And you might say, well, how is that possible? It's my max. Well, it's your VO2 max. So that is the maximum amount of oxygen you can use. But remember, we have anaerobic energy systems as well. So as we go beyond our VO2 max, we have what's called an oxygen deficit. So our oxygen available does not meet the necessary demands of energy production for the work we're doing. And we start to produce energy more and more anaerobically. And it's really in that area when we're above VO2 max that heart rate tends to become a less reliable metric for what zone we're in. And that's because heart rate doesn't fluctuate super fast. In fact, even doing zone 4 efforts, you will see a generally slow rise and a steady plateau until you reach your threshold heart rate, even at the correct intensity. And similar to, so there I already mentioned O2 deficit. O2 debt happens after you finish. It is in recovery. You need excess O2 to aerobically recover your systems. And similar to cardiac drift, there is something called a VO2 slow component. So if you are above your threshold, you will see a rise in your VO2 as you continue to work, even at the same steady state. And the reason for that generally is because as we work, our muscles become fatigued, they become less efficient, especially our respiratory muscles in this case, become way less efficient, and therefore the energy demand required increases. So we start taking in more O2 and using more O2. So if you're, again, using a mask now, doing tests, and you are looking at gas exchange analysis, this is where we get a little bit more fine-tuned. You can use what's called the RER, the respiratory exchange ratio, to figure out exactly where different zones are occurring, right? So the RER, as you can see in the top right, is the volume of exhaled CO2 divided by the volume of oxygen that you are inhaling and using. So you can see RER there. It starts at around 0.8, it dips to around 0.07, and then it begins to rise and hit 1. And the reason we have those ratios, so at 0.7, you're using primarily fat. At 1, you're using almost no fat, almost exclusively carbohydrates. The reason we get those ratios, as you can see on the bottom stoichiometrically, when you combust either a carbohydrate or fat, you get these different ratios of CO2 and O2. So the top one is a carbohydrate, right? When you combust that, you get 6 CO2 from using 6 O2. So that ratio is about 1. Whereas when you combust fat, you get much more ATP. It's much more efficient. You release much more, much less CO2 from the O2 that you put into it. The ratio is about 0.7. And so when we look at this fuel usage chart, and I'll show you a real world example of one soon, you can see that at fat max, where your fat oxidation is maximized, is RER of 0.7. That's going to be your zone 2, right? So that's where you have maximal fat oxidation. That's commonly referred to as the aerobic threshold. When you go over that, you stop using fat very, very quickly. So your fat usage drops, carb usage continues to rise this whole time. And eventually you get to an RER of 1. So you're relying solely on carbohydrates. And at that point is determined your anaerobic threshold. And that's your zone 4, right? So those are, again, 2 very important zones for training. And I want to note something: the absolute versus relative fat max. Your fat max here that you can see on this graph is actually an absolute fat max, right? So it is the most fat you can oxidize, right? Relatively speaking, though, it's not a maximum because you're also burning carbohydrates, a pretty fair amount, actually. When you're at rest, you're burning almost no carbohydrates. You're burning exclusively fat. So relatively, it's more fat when you're at rest. But when you're working, it's absolutely a greater amount, but relatively less because you are burning some carbs. And then you can also use lactate testing. So there are 2 thresholds that we see at lactate testing: LT1, lactate threshold 1, and LT2, lactate threshold 2. And those correspond roughly to zone 2 and zone 4. So LT1 is that first point on the left with the vertical dotted line. That is when your lactate levels really first begin to rise above resting lactate levels. If you stay at any intensity between LT1 and LT2, generally, your lactate levels will rise, but they'll plateau. When you pass LT2, you get OBLA, which is another term there, OBLA, onset of blood lactate accumulation. So when you surpass LT2, our ability to process lactate can no longer keep up. So our ability to process it aerobically can no longer keep up with our rate of glycolysis as it's increasing. So what happens is our body starts to dump lactate into our blood, and it accumulates exponentially. So it goes from a linear rise in lactate to an exponential rise in lactate. LT2 is also termed the maximum lactate steady state. So again, it's the maximum point at which we can process lactate at the same rate that it is produced, right? So you don't see that exponential rise in our blood. We also have way on the right, the topmost point that we have is our VLA max. So that's the maximum rate of lactate accumulation that we can make. And that is really an assessment of our glycolytic, our maximum glycolytic power, right? So that's really important for shorter events like track events, pool swimming, 400, 800, things that are a couple minutes. So things that are really in that maximum glycolytic power zone, right? So people generally talk about LT1 and LT2 occurring at 2 and 4 millimole. That's another one of those sort of quick and dirty estimates. It's an average. I think if you want to be really, really precise, you have to base it more off of, again, when it's rising above resting and when you see that exponential accumulation in blood. But if you see when people cross 2 and 4 millimole of blood lactate concentration, that's a much quicker, dirtier way of saying, okay, yeah, that's roughly where zone 2 and zone 4 are. So how will different types of training impact this curve, right? If you are focused a lot on aerobic training and building a big aerobic engine and endurance training, generally what's going to happen is the curve is going to shift to the right and it's going to shift down. And our VLA max is also going to come down. So it's going to decrease our glycolytic ability a little bit, but we become extremely aerobically efficient, right? And that's generally very good for us because we want to delay fatigue and last as long as possible in a lot of these endurance events. Whereas if you do, like team sport events, things that are really high intensity, short repeat intervals, what's going to happen is the curve will shift the other way to the left and up. And actually what you'll see for the VLA max is it'll shoot way up and to the right because you become very powerful glycolytically, right? But you're maybe a little bit less efficient aerobically, right? So there's trade-offs in how we decide to train for the event that we're doing. So I'm going to pose another question to you guys. What is happening with our energy systems at and beyond that maximum lactate steady state? So my reminder to you is that energy systems are mixer boards and not switches. And another hint I'll give you is that one of my professors said that the anaerobic threshold is neither anaerobic nor a threshold, but beyond that, that's a perfect name for it, right? And the reason being is that what's actually happening, right, is not a switch from an aerobic energy system to an anaerobic energy system. They're both present. In fact, it's still an aerobic effort, but the rate of anaerobic energy production is slowly increasing. How do we know that it's not a fully anaerobic effort? How do we know we're not switching, as some people might think? Well, think about where it is relative to VO2 max. VO2 max is the maximum amount of oxygen that we can take in and use for energy production, right? So if our VO2 max is much higher than our lactate threshold, we know that we still have the capacity to increase how much energy we're burning aerobically. But the rates of aerobic and anaerobic energy production are increasing differently. So our anaerobic energy production is increasing at a slightly higher rate. And therefore we see this lactate accumulation, right? Cool. Oh, okay. So some food for thought about those two testing methods with VO2 and lactate. How do we feel about them for VO2 testing? How do we feel about lactate versus VO2 testing for zone determination? Well, lactate is a much quicker and easier way to do it, but it's maybe less precise, right? We still get some idea of what our body is doing aerobically, but it's really a much better indicator of what's happening glycolytically, right? Anaerobically, especially at the peak anaerobic capacity, right? When we get that VLA max, right? That's a very important metric. VO2 max testing, on the other hand, is way more precise in that you know exactly what fuels you're using and where that fuel use change is happening. And so we can figure out exactly where, right, your zone 2 is, exactly where your zone 4 is. and exactly where those other zones around them are, right? So a little more precise, really the gold standard for zone determination, in my opinion. We also talk about VO2 max as being sort of a predictor for athletic success. And I just want to dispel that myth a little bit. Other people in the world of athletics know this as well. VO2 max is correlated to some degree with athletic success in endurance sports, right? The higher your VO2 max is, generally, the better you're going to do. What we're finding now, though, especially among elite and well-trained populations, more so than absolute VO2 max, is really your economy or your efficiency. So how long can you sit at maybe 90% of your VO2 max versus your absolute VO2 max compared to your competition? Because let's say I have a competitor whose VO2 max is way, way higher than mine, but he peters out and fatigues at 60% of his VO2 max, but I can sit at 65, 70, 75% of my VO2 max all day. I might just beat him even though my VO2 max is lower. So really, it's economy that becomes a better predictor of athletic success. Cool. So now that we've talked a bit about zone determination, I can show you some of my results here. So you get a real world example from that test that I did with Chris. So here you're seeing my VO2 as time goes on. So that is this green line here next to the red line. It goes up and up and up. And then when I stopped the test, obviously it dropped down. My heart rate is that light blue line above it. So it's a graded test. It goes up and up and up. And then when I finally got tired, I stopped. It went down. And that red line is VCO2, right? So it goes up and up and up as well as I'm working harder and harder and harder. And then it drops down. And you can use that to plot my RER. So again, this is the ratio of CO2 and O2. And you can see at rest, it's pretty low, mostly fats. It drops down to 0.7 right here, roughly. But it didn't get quite down to 0.7, but it drops down at my aerobic threshold and then climbs. Right here at about 1 is my anaerobic threshold, which is neither anaerobic nor a threshold, and then continues to rise. You know, people can get to about 1.1, 1.2, but beyond that, you just kind of tank and you're tired and you're done. And then here again is that fuel usage graph. So you can really see this well here. My carbohydrate use just climbs and climbs and climbs as the intensity increases. But you can see my fat use maximizes right here at my zone 2, and then drops and drops and drops right here at my zone 4. I'm really relying solely on carbs at this point, whereas here I was using both fats and carbs. Cool. So now we have this zone 2, we have this zone 4, maybe we have some zones around it. Why do we train in them? Why do we train at them in different amounts? Well, let's talk about that. So zone 2 is that fat max portion. Zone 2 training is really used to increase that intensity at fat max. So the more time you spend at fat max, it'll raise your fat max. And that's good because it spares glycogen, right? So again, carbohydrate energy is saved. That extends time to fatigue, because remember, when we run out of carbohydrates, that's when we feel like crap. That's when we stop. It also increases our postural strength. So our postural muscles, if we're sitting on a bike all day, if we're running, they become a little bit more efficient, right? And it can help us get more comfortable staying in those positions for extended periods of time. And the way these adaptations are mediated is primarily through growth of type 1 muscle fibers. So these are our slow twitch muscle fibers. And that is really due to increase in mitochondria, right? Mitochondrial biogenesis, right? And those are, the respiring organelles in our cells. Those are where we use oxygen, where we burn fat, where we burn carbohydrates aerobically, right? So that's the big thing. And that's really where you make your engine much bigger, right? As an endurance athlete. We also get, again, increased oxidative enzymes. Another benefit is we increase fatty acid transport. So the fat that's in our muscles, when we sit here in this zone, that's how we train our body to say, hey, get that fat that's in our muscle cells and bring it to where it needs to be so that it can be processed aerobically, right? So we increase the movement of that fat in our body. So given how amazing zone 2 training is, why don't we just do all zone 2? Well, it makes our engine bigger, but not necessarily more powerful, right? So sitting at zone two a lot um, actually decreases our glycolytic ability a lot. If you remember that shift in that lactate curve is sort of emblematic of that, right? Additionally, it does tend to make us a little bit weaker. So when we transition our muscle fibers to more type 1 muscle fibers, those are less powerful muscle fibers. So an overabundance of that is generally not a good thing. But that tends to not be too much of an issue for endurance athletes. But again, there is a balance. Also, because you can sit at this intensity so long, and we do sit at this intensity so long, we have a propensity to increase our risk for overuse injuries. Now, those last two things, we can mitigate that primarily through strength training. So I'm a huge proponent of strength training for endurance athletes as well. It's critically important. I think it's very undervalued. But strength training makes us powerful and it makes us sturdy. So we don't get injured and we get very, very strong, right? While still making our engine, our aerobic engine, bigger. So the next question we could ask is, why do any zone two? Well, if you're a soccer player or a football player, because of those other bad, quote unquote, bad things that I mentioned before, you might not want to do zone two. Those people should probably just do interval sprinting to condition themselves. They don't get that big aerobic engine. They get a very powerful glycolytic engine, but they don't really need that aerobic engine. So for them, it's okay. For us, absolutely not the case. Our sport is aerobic primarily. We need to be able to go very, very long. And we also need to be able to support the training volumes that are necessary for those adaptations to happen. You can't spend, 15 hours of training a week at threshold. You'll die, right? Like that's so hard. So you have to do a lot of zone two training and get a lot of those zone two mediated adaptations as an endurance athlete. One thing I just wanted to touch on briefly is people talk about maybe doing the benefits of fasted zone two. So you're glycogen depleted, you don't have any carbohydrates in you. It works for some people anecdotally. There's some evidence to say that it works, but it's sort of a toss up. I'm not a huge fan for myself, and I am hesitant to recommend it to people because it doesn't feel good because again you're glycogen depleted, so you're essentially bonking before you even start, right? And also because even at zone two, if you remember back to that graph I showed you earlier, you're still burning carbohydrates. So if you are at an intensity that requires more than just the fact that you're burning maximally and you're not getting it from carbohydrates, my guess is you're probably supplementing it with protein or something, and that means that you're maybe predisposing yourself to, less effective training or even mild injury if you do it very, very long. And that's what I would suspect, and why I would be hesitant to recommend it. But then again, we're all different. No one's average. If you really feel you want to try it, power to you. If it works for you, power to you. But it's not really for me personally. So key point in all this zone two training. Why do you want to avoid going above zone two? Right? It's very important that we stay in that zone two when we're in a zone two training session. The primary reason for this is if you're going above zone two a lot, you accumulate more lactate. And remember, I said lactate is an amazing thing. It's not a bad guy, it's a good guy. This is where it sort of becomes a bad guy for us. Not because it makes us tired, not because it hurts us, but because lactate can actually function almost hormonally and signal to our cells that, hey, we're working pretty hard. Let's not use fat right now. Let's focus on glycolysis and using carbohydrates as an energy system. So you're blunting essentially your ability to use fats, and mitigating the whole purpose of a zone two workout, right? Additionally, if you're above zone two a lot, that's a little bit more residual fatigue that you're going to have. That's harder to recover from, which means that when you do need to go hard, right, it's that much more difficult because you're more tired and your training isn't going to be quite as good. So the takeaway here is if you need to do zone two, right? If you're not, you're shooting yourself in the foot. You're making your hard days harder and you're making your easy days less effective, right? The other zone we talk about is the anaerobic threshold, neither anaerobic nor a threshold. So zone 4. Um, when you train a lot in this area, what you get is you get decreased pyruvate reduction. So remember, pyruvate is the precursor to lactate, and it's what is reduced into lactate. When you train at zone 4, you become better at shuttling pyruvate directly into the Krebs cycle without going into without becoming lactate, right? You also get increased pyruvate and lactate shuttling. So the lactate that you do produce is either shuttled into the mitochondria more effectively, or it's shuttled out of the muscle fiber into your blood where it can be taken up by another muscle fiber and then oxidized aerobically, right? So again, this is still an aerobic effort, right? And you're increasing your aerobic capacity. There is some also beta oxidation or fat oxidation improvement, not as much as zone 2, but there still is some. And again, this is mediated through increasing, mitochondrial proliferation and biogenesis, a lot of increase in mitochondrial enzymes. So what we're kind of noticing here, there's some overlap, right? So zone 2 and zone 4, are they really the same side of this lactate processing coin? Well, yes. So there are these transporters in our mitochondria and in our cell membranes called monocarboxylate transporters, or MCTs. There's different types of them, and they reside mostly in different muscle fiber types. And zone 2 and zone 4 target these different monocarboxylate transporters, which are responsible for moving lactate and pyruvate around, right? So by doing this, we make our body better at processing and metabolizing lactate as well as fat at these different intensities. So again, how is the lactate shuttle helpful during exercise? It's moving that carbon energy around to active tissues that need it. It's signaling to cells, hey, we're increasing intensity. We need to burn more carbs. Whereas after exercise, as I mentioned before, it's getting us ready to make more glucose, right? So it's a gluconeogenic precursor. It's helpful in recovery, in restoring and recycling that carbon energy in the form of carbohydrates. Then we have zone 5. So this is where we're hitting that VO2 max level. So this is above zone 4, right? Not quite maximal, but pretty hard. Something that you could maybe do for several minutes, before you peter over and fall over. The adaptations here are a little bit more macroanatomy in scale, so a little bit easier to wrap your head around maybe. Primarily, you get an increased stroke volume in your heart. So that literally means your heart can pump out more blood with each beat. And that's mediated primarily through increase in your left ventricle size. So that's the chamber of your heart that's responsible for getting blood out to your body. You get more capillaries, right? So more oxygen perfusion in your body, and you get more blood, higher plasma volume, so more blood in your body, so more oxygen carrying capacity. You also get increased arterial and venous O2 difference. So that means you have more oxygen coming in your arteries, or there's a larger difference between the oxygen level in your arteries and in your veins, which means that more oxygen is being extracted by tissues, essentially. You also will increase the concentration of myoglobin. The myoglobin is essentially the equivalent of hemoglobin in your blood, right? So in your blood, you have hemoglobin, which carries oxygen. It carries it to a muscle. It gives the oxygen to your muscle, and your muscle carries it with myoglobin, and the myoglobin carries it to your mitochondria, where aerobic respiration happens. You also get some increase in mitochondrial concentration, right? Some more mitochondria. Again, more overlap, right? Because this is still aerobic, mind you. Excuse me. Skipped a couple things. Okay, there we go. So finally, we have our zone 6. So this is where you're actually sprinting. This is, glycolytic and a maximal PCR work. You're going really fast. There are metabolic benefits to this, but another really big thing that I want to highlight is you get an increase in what's called your stretch shortening cycle, the SSC. So that is essentially your tendons become stiffer, right? They become, if you think of your tendon as like a rubber band, they get thicker and stronger and more elastic. And that's helpful because, especially in things like running, that's a plyometric action with a short ground contact time. our tendons act like rubber bands and store energy and make us more efficient, right? So when we bounce off the ground as we're running along, we put less energy into each step, and more energy is recycled from, just falling onto our tendon as we run forward. And if you remember, economy is a huge determinant of performance, even more so than VO2, right? Um, and what the consequence of this is exactly what I just said. You get decreased energy demand for force production all over. So you're mechanically more efficient. And that's why sprinting is very, very important, and technique work as well, right? This is where you want perfect form, right? In order to get these adaptations. So you might have noticed I skipped zone 3. So what about zone 3? Some people aren't a fan of this. Zone 3, sometimes referred to as tempo. So it's somewhere in between zone 2 and zone 4. Well, for some people, it's kind of where you find their fat max if they have a really high fat max. Some might argue, well, that means it's their zone 2. And I say, okay, fine, it's their zone 2. But again, this kind of highlights why testing is very, very important, right? The issue with zone 3 is we find those metabolic adaptations to be less specific, right? So you don't quite get the benefits that you get from zone 2, and you don't quite get the benefits that you get from zone 4, which is why it's really important, again, on those days where you have those, distinct efforts, to be in those training zones, right? That being said, it still is probably a good idea to do some zone 3. Now, why might that be? Well, your threshold is an effort that you can probably hold for, colloquially, it's said about an hour. Zone 2, you could hold like forever. It's super, super easy. But if you're doing an event that lasts several hours and you are racing it and you don't want to go super easy, you're probably going to be racing it in your zone 3. So you want to have maybe some familiarity neuromuscularly, psychologically, with this sort of effort being sustained for a very long amount of time. So to that end, it's probably very important to do some of it, especially as a supplement to other higher intensity work. So now that we've covered our zones, we can move a bit into periodization. So there's a couple different ways of determining how much of each zone you should do as you go through a season. The three biggest ones that I want to talk about are linear, block, and undulating. I'll go over them very, very quickly, but let's go back and look at them right there in those graphics. So linear is in the top left there. Very basically, it's a gradual shift from a very high volume, low intensity training distribution to a much lower volume, higher intensity training distribution when you get to your event that you're peaking for. And again, it's gradual. So every week you might see a slight drop in volume and a slight increase in the amount of intensity you're doing. Then there's block periodization. So as opposed to it being gradual, you have these distinct training blocks, right? So you have this accumulation phase where you're only sitting in a high volume, a lot of intensity, and maybe very starkly after a couple of weeks or a month, you switch to a more moderate training volume with a lot more intensity. And then in your realization phase, as you're getting ready to peak, you keep the intensity, but you drop the volume a lot so you can recover and sort of realize those training gains, right? And then there's something a little bit more complicated, is the undulating. So you can see that in the bottom left, where every in smaller increments made by weeks, you change the focus. So maybe first week is a volume focused week. The second week is somewhat more hybrid, like you're slightly lower training volume, but you're throwing in some intensity. And then the week after that, you do a little bit more. And then the week after that, you do a really hard week with very low volume, and then you transition. So you take a recovery and then you go back. That's very frequently applied to lifting as well. So those methods of periodizing your training distribution really depend on how many races you're doing. What you prefer is a big part of it. And again, what event you're racing towards and what your goals are. In all of those periodization methods, people talk a lot about the 80-20 distribution. So 80% of your training should be zone 2, 20% should be zone 4 and above, very, very hard, right? So a very large proportion is easy, very small proportion is very, very hard and intensely focused and done very well, right? High quality work. Well, it should all be high quality, even the easy stuff. But I kind of question, when exactly does that hold true? If and my opinion is, if you are doing very, very large training volumes, the 80-20 distribution is great. If you're doing 10 plus, 15 plus hour weeks, then absolutely you should be doing 80-20. It's still going to be a lot of threshold training, but if you were to do any more than that, you would be so fatigued that you probably wouldn't be able to tolerate it. And that's why it's very good for elite athletes who have huge training volumes as well. If you're a slightly more time crunched athlete, if your training week is 6 to 8 hours a week, which is fine, right? We all have different lives and different goals. You might want to slightly raise the proportion of threshold training that you're doing, right? Because you still want to make your engine more powerful, right? You can make it bigger, but you in the zone 2, but you make it more powerful in the zone 4, right? So there's also different distributions within different disciplines depending on if you're a triathlete. So for instance, in swimming, there's much less mechanical stress on our body. There's way less impact that comes from those higher zones than, say, in running. So you can probably handle a higher proportion of higher intensity zone training in swimming than you can, say, in running, relatively. Because if you did just as much zone 4 running just as much zone 4 running as you did zone 4 swimming, you're probably going to hurt yourself, right? So these are other factors to consider. Along with that, you might look at athlete age. So as we age, especially as we get into like middle age and later age in our life, we have a tendency of our muscle fibers to shift to type 1 anyway, right? And if you are an older athlete, that you might want to spend more time focusing on higher intensities and having a lower training volume overall to mitigate that age-related fiber type transition and maintain strength, right? The same might be true for someone who has a very high training age, even if they're younger, right? So say, you've been racing for like 20 years and you're like 35, 40, and you have so much zone 2 training under your belt, you're loaded with mitochondria. You might get more out of training at a higher intensity, again, while minimizing training volume to minimize, while lowering training volume to minimize injury risk and things like that. You might get more out of that higher intensity than you would by doing additional zone 2. Whereas if you're very young, you haven't done hardly any endurance training, you stand so much to gain by doing a very large training volume composed of a lot of zone 2 training, right? And really causing a lot of mitochondrial biogenesis to happen. And I would say the biggest factor in deciding what your training zone distribution should look like is the demands of what you're doing, right? So to a first approximation, you are emulating the demands of your event in whole or in part. So if I'm doing an Ironman, right, triathlon, I'm going to be doing way more zone 2, way more training volume, way longer rides than if I'm training for a sprint or an Olympic distance triathlon. If I'm doing that, I'm going to be doing way more zone 4, and I'm probably not going to be doing as much of a training volume because it's not necessary, right? My event is 1 or 2 hours versus, if I'm really, really good, best in the world, 7 or 8, all the way up to 10 to 12 to 16, right? Depending on who you are. Very different. So what does this mean for someone who's a cyclist? Exactly what I just said, right? And if you think outside of triathlon, right? If you're a cyclist and you are engaging other racers while you're racing, and tactics are part of it, and the intensity of your work is not always as constant as it is maybe in most triathlons, or say you're doing a draft legal triathlon, you might want to reflect that in your workouts. So you're probably going to do workouts that vary much more in intensity than the workouts of a triathlete, right? Because a triathlete is essentially time trialing all the time, whereas a cyclist, they do time trials, but they also, right, draft off people. They get to rest. There are surges and pelotons, and those are things that they need to be able to prepare for metabolically, right, in their training. So I think that's a good overview of everything I wanted to say. Here's some more coaching resources for you guys. My card is in that QR code. Um, so we do train with Training Peaks, but we really are excited about TriDot and RunDot. These are these AI training platforms. They can be used both with and without a coach. They're an excellent AI tool. They really take a lot of the thinking out of it for you as an athlete. And again, they're not a replacement for a coach. I think that they're a very powerful tool in the hands of a very knowledgeable coach. They make your coach much more efficient. They can focus on how you are doing as a person, and they can still monitor your training and adjust it as necessary based on your feedback to them, right? So an incredible resource. I've loved using it as an athlete, and I encourage you guys to check it out. Right now, they're doing the preseason project. So you get 2 months of free trial of either TriDot or RunDot if you're a triathlete or a runner. In addition to that, TriDot does a lot of really cool things. They certify coaches in their TriDot Academy, so you can become a TriDot coach. They're a partner of USA Triathlon. They have a lot of cool swag. They have an amazing podcast. They also have pool schools. So if you want to sign up for a pool school and really want to work on swimming, especially if you're an adult who's new to swimming, they're very helpful. So they just have an excellent community and resources as well. So they have different pricing options available for TriDot. The premium would be a full coached athlete, so you get a private coach, dedicated coach. And then they have these other tiers. So Mark Allen edition comes with instructional videos and stuff. Complete gives you all of RaceX, which we'll show you in a bit. And then there are these lower tiers as well if you don't race as frequently. And RunDot is also very similarly structured. So both of those platforms use RaceX, which allows you to import your race events into the app, which is how it structures your training plans. They give you predicted times. You can make nutritional notes. They even do power profiles for bike courses that are downloaded on there. So they have the GPX courses for bike courses and runs, which is really amazing. I think it's really fun to just toy with and see your predicted times. It's generally very accurate, so it's a pretty incredible tool as well. And then I'll give it back to Chris for a little bit, and he can talk about the 4-star club.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I feel like I got an 8-hour lecture in a 1-hour time frame. Learned quite a bit. So even though I run a metabolic testing lab, I feel like I learned more just listening to you as well, Ricky. But yeah, so what other option we have, it's kind of like our starter pack for most of the athletes that our coaches work with. We have something called the 4-star club, which is just our club for endurance athletes. So if you guys are interested in getting a little bit of light coaching support, we include a couple of coach consultations with that, training tools that you need. We also have discounts with different partners and sponsors, discounts on metabolic testing, but we also give bonus consultations. So you get 2 consults, one to set up your season. Just sit down with Ricky if you want to, or me or any of our coaches, and put together a big annual plan, talk about your races, map things out. And then we also give you a consultation where we use a tool like RaceX to plan out your race. And that's just part of what's included in that package if you're just looking to kind of get engaged with a coach. Additionally, if you use a tool like TriDot, you get an additional consult to get that set up as well. So whether you're doing private coaching or you just want to use one of these tools on your own, that's really what the 4-star club is for. So if you're interested in that, feel free to take a look at the website. It's for working with any of our coaches at the 4-star Endurance, but I'm not going to do a big sales pitchy thing. I just wanted to mention that as a resource. The main thing, if you liked what you learned from Ricky, I know it can be quite a bit. I would encourage you to reach out to him, schedule a free consult with him if you like. Use that QR code. He's got all his contact details on there. And then he also has links to both RunDot and TriDot. And we have the preseason project going on for that, where you get 2 months of the AI powered training plan tool for free. The way I like to look at TriDot and RunDot is if you took Ricky's brain and you put it into an app that would take care of everything you learned today and just automated everything, that's essentially what you're getting. Because it takes a lot as a coach to do and plan everything perfectly in terms of your season, the workouts, the intervals, the training load, all that stuff you just learned. So if you're like, wow, that's a lot and I don't have time to absorb all of it, but I'm very interested in it, then a tool like TriDot and RunDot is really kind of the perfect tool for that. Especially if this is your kind of in between transition season or whatnot. So take advantage of that free offer. It won't be around very long, so it's usually only around for a couple months during the off season or preseason, as we like to call it. But with that, I want to kind of wrap it up. So I'm actually going to end the recording and then open it up to questions. I've got a couple questions here in the chat already. So we'll wrap it up here for the recording.